We have a quorum here, and hopefully people are finding it. I think they moved the room on us, but it seems like people are making their way in. My name's Jeff Brown. I'm going to be presiding over the session, I should say, today. In terms of introducing myself, I'm with FGE. It's a consulting group. We basically, most of the big people who buy and sell LNG in this part of the world, pretty much all of them are clients. We have a retainer type service where we provide strategic advice to them. So in my comments today, I'm hopefully going to try to bring a little bit of that side of things. In terms of my personal background, I was started out in academics and then went and actually worked in consulting for a while, and then worked at the IEA, and then consulting again, and then worked at JP Morgan on the finance side and trading side, and then back now in consulting. So that's my background. If you look at the topic today, we're going to speak on global gas market dynamics. And you know, this is obviously a big topic. We discussed this as a group. It's a big area, but if you think about global dynamics, essentially what we're looking at here is we're looking at different regions where we have things happening within regions, and then it generally gets interconnected, at least out here, through LNG, right? So LNG is the connection device. In the past, that connection device hadn't been very sort of large in the market and hadn't been able to necessarily close arbitration gaps, but it's looking more and more like the arb will increasingly get closed or get influenced by LNG, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about that later. It's appropriate we're discussing gas dynamics in Singapore. I've lived in Singapore for 11 years, and I can tell you certainly over the last 10 years and certainly the last 5, everyone who's doing anything in LNG has moved out here. If it's especially the majors. We saw Roger Bounds spoke yesterday. I don't know if he would have been out here 10 years ago, but now all the heads tend to be out in this region. He's nodding, so people have moved out in general. So all the action is in this part of the world, and Singapore has been very actively trying to create a gas hub. I think partly because they want to make it, you know, sort of like they've on the oil side. Obviously, it's a very large oil trading center, and it's not necessarily a physical oil hub yet, but in terms of all the decision makers and all the activity, it's all based out of Singapore now. We have 3 eminently qualified speakers today. I think many of them are probably familiar to you. You've seen their work before. The topics we're going to cover, one is focused on Europe and Russia and the dynamics at play there. And again, Europe will likely be a place where LNG prices may be set out of Europe, essentially. So it's very important that we understand Europe, even if we're sitting out in Asia, and what will happen there and the dynamics. We're also going to take a bigger look at the LNG picture. So I think it gives you a very good snapshot of where we are and where we're going in terms of LNG. And then we're going to look at a more formal model of gas market dynamics, and especially as it applies to Asia. So this all should be quite relevant. It occurred to me yesterday, just to kick off, when a person asked what is JKM in one of the sessions, that it's appropriate, since we all don't have, haven't worked in LNG our whole lives or worked in gas out in Asia, that maybe we need to start with just a little bit of background on how this market works, and I'll try to give it more of an energy economics type spin if I could. And again, the people on the panel may disagree with me, so we're certainly open to that. First of all, as many of you will be aware, LNG is sort of a niche fuel. What you do is you cool gas down to -161 and Celsius, and you ship it on a big thermos, essentially, potentially long distances. It's only about 3% of global energy use, so it's relatively small, 10% of global gas consumption, but it's got close to about a third of global trade in gas is in LNG. So it sort of hits above its weight in terms of its influence on the market, right? It's sort of that dynamic midfielder. It takes the gas where it needs to go. So even though it's relatively small, it can be quite influential in terms of marginal price setting. There's 4 sort of key questions that I would think about if I'm an energy economist looking at LNG. First of all, I would try to really nail down what is LNG. And some people, one person told me once that there's no real such thing as LNG. I mean, LNG, no one buys LNG. They buy gas. And I don't think that's really true, actually. There are markets where they buy gas, and I think actually, again, Roger alluded to this yesterday. I mean, we have some markets where gas is purchased, but if you look at the market, there's a lot of markets around the world where they're buying LNG specifically. They're pricing it differently. They're thinking about it differently. Some of the markets, it's sort of like, we need some LNG. It's sort of like taking vitamins, right? LNG is good for us, so we need some of that, okay? So there are markets out there where domestic gas has much different price and thought of much differently from LNG. So we need to acknowledge that when we get out into some parts of the world. It's not necessarily a liquid market in some areas. I was just in India, for example, and one client was there telling me that if the price goes above about $5 per million BTU, they have people defaulting on their contracts. Okay, they're buying LNG. If it goes above $5, they have people defaulting. If it's down about $4.50, they can sell it out their ears. Okay, so very, very, very price sensitive in some of these markets. Is LNG competitive? So this is sort of a link question. Is it competitive? In many, many markets it is. It tends to compete best in markets where there aren't a lot of alternatives. If you think about Japan and Korea, it gets tougher if you go to markets where I was just, like India, where I was just at, and also in China. Again, we saw China, we'll hear later about Chinese demand. It grew a whole lot last year, but a lot of that was because LNG was pushed at it under long-term contracts. They didn't, if it was purely up to them, a lot of the companies would not have taken all that LNG because basically they signed up for contracts and then they have a hard time selling it domestically. Another example for you, GAIL of India. They bought 5.8 million tons of LNG from the US. They've only been able to sell about 1 million of it in the country. So now they're sitting there, what are we going to do? Right? So there's a lot of these issues where people look at LNG, get interested and excited about it, but then they have to figure out how to put it into their home country. What does it cost to develop? It's good to have in our minds. There's a wide range of estimates. I mean, for different projects, I would say at the lower end, if you're looking at a greenfield project, probably about $7 maybe is where you'd be at, delivered in Asia, at the lower end. There's also projects out there that seem to be trying to go forward even over $10 per million BTU. And we have to keep in mind, this is a market right now where long-term contracts would be about, delivered would be about six or so in today's oil price environment. Spot in Asia is about $5.50. Europe's about $4.50. US is $3. So if you think around, right now LNG looks expensive relative to where the market is pricing today. Basically, as was discussed earlier in the open session, under $60 as it stands right now, LNG has a tough time. What is the LNG price? The last question that I would pose, or at least try to answer. And the real honest answer is you don't really, maybe who knows is too broad to say, but there's not really a specific LNG price that you can point to, at least out in Asia. JKM, the Japan-Korea marker, was discussed yesterday. It seems if you ask people what the LNG price is, typically they'll be referring to that in terms of a spot price. But there's all kinds of contracts going on where people will be discussing long-term contracts which are still typically linked to oil. And I think it's important we have an idea of what's happening in those discussions before we jump in. Currently, it used to be typically for a long, long time, we'd have an oil linkage that was about 85% oil linkage. Now with the market coming under some pressure, I would say the market is around a 70% oil linkage, or maybe even a little less than that. So it has come down, and people will talk about slopes all the time in terms of various numbers, but these are indicative of 14.5, 14.85, 11.5. If you hear these types of slopes, that's an oil linkage, and these are the ratios that we'll be looking at. Of course, there also has been gas sold linked to Henry Hub, and we'll talk about that a little bit. To give you an idea of the type of formula that you see, typical Henry Hub formula would be a fixed number, say $3, a sort of fixed cost, essentially you're renting the liquefaction, and then you would take you'd have Henry Hub times a number. For a lot of the contracts, it was Henry Hub times 1.15. Okay, so Henry Hub's today about 3, so you'd be paying $3.45. So 3 plus $3.45, and then ship it out to Asia, say $1.50. So you're looking at $8 roughly. Okay, delivered in Asia, full cycle cost. Of course, now LNG will still move. When you look at marginal costs, it will still move. But right now, if you look full cycle cost, U.S. LNG has a difficult time. Well, can't get into Asia basically at today's market prices. So that's what I wanted to share. Please keep these things in the back of your mind as we progress. Okay, and let me introduce today's speakers. First, on the far left, we have Professor Jonathan Stern. Through the years, I've certainly tracked his work. I'm sure many of you have if you follow gas. He founded the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies Natural Gas Research Program in 2003. He moved up through the title ranks there, and he's become a distinguished fellow in October 2016. He's held a number of positions at various institutions and areas. I'll list a few of those. The Center for Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee, the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London, the Energy Delta Institute, and IEJ. From 2011 to 16, this is very relevant to his talk today. He was the EU Speaker of the EU-Russia Gas Advisory Council, and he's the author and editor of several books, including Natural Gas in Asia, The Price of Internationally Traded Gas, and several papers that are quite relevant again today, looking at dynamics of gas in Asia. Our second speaker, sitting next to Jonathan, is Miss Anne-Sophie Corbeau. She's with Kapsarc, and this is the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. If any of you had a chance to go there, it's paradise in terms of a research center. I got the chance to go right when it just opened, and I can tell you it's extremely extraordinarily nice building, a nice facility. She is the co-editor. She has 15 years of experience, over 15 years of experience in the energy industry. She was at the IEA, and before that she was with IHS CERA. She was a senior gas expert at the IEA. She developed the midterm gas report, which many of you may see. Midterm reports are tough because you actually have to make calls on infrastructure and what will actually come. If you look out to 2040, you can sort of draw lines, but a midterm report, you actually have to make calls on what projects will come. And then our last speaker today will be Robert Brooks, or Bob Brooks. He's the president of RBAC. He's an applied mathematician, software systems designer, and energy economist with over 40 years of experience in developing decision support systems for industry, analysts, and government policymakers. He says in his bio that he has an eclectic educational background. I thought it was quite interesting and appropriate for what he does. He has a degree in arts and science from Berkeley, physics from UT Austin, and PhD in management and operations research from MIT. So he's done a little bit of everything. It's very appropriate background for what he does in terms of modeling. He has, if you look at his CV, he has a lot of various background working for governments, looking at modeling transportation systems, energy systems, and he designed the GPCM natural gas market forecasting system with which a number of consulting firms and other firms use to look at the natural gas market in North America. And he's going to talk a little bit further about the model that he's developed, which is relevant to the market out here. So with that, that's the speaking team today, and I'll get out of the way and turn the floor over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for getting up in time to come to listen to us. We thought we might be quite lonely a few minutes ago. I've chosen this topic deliberately because for the last, I think, about a year or a couple of years, every journalist who calls me up wants to know, can US LNG compete with Russian gas in Europe, as if these were the only two sources of gas that Europe had available to it. Now, I know that the geopolitical symbolism of US LNG versus Russian pipeline gas is irresistible, especially for think tank people, for journalists, because, you know, it's just an absolutely beautiful vision. However, what I want to try and say to you is the picture is significantly more complicated and I think interesting than that. And this is what I'm going to talk about. One of the extraordinary things about European gas as a topic, well, possibly gas in general, but European gas particularly, is that nobody in Europe can ever speak about what's really important and urgent. They can only speak about what's in the press. And this is really problematic, especially for many of you who do not live in Europe, but even for people who do. So let me hurry along. How long have I got?
I told everyone precise. I said 18 minutes.
Okay.
So I was being real precise, but we can go 20.
Very Anglo-Saxon. Okay, very good. Okay, so let me start by saying that many people, even in Europe, don't realise that the post-2008 period in Europe has been something of a catastrophe for gas. We lost 20 years of demand by 2014, and only in the last 2 years, and particularly since this is not temperature-corrected data, only in 2016 have we seen a real upturn in temperature-corrected European gas demand. Now, the other difficult thing when generalising about regions is that actually regions are composed of countries, and very different things happen in these countries. And here on this slide, I think I only have 31 European countries instead of 35 that we normally do, but this is small enough. So really the thing to point out is that very, very different things happen in these countries. You'll see that only a few countries in Europe have very significant gas demand. The rule of thumb is that 7 or 8 countries in Europe account for about 80% of Europe's gas demand, very, very roughly. And what you'll see is that, or maybe you'll see depending on how close to the front you are, is that actually different things were happening, and in particular countries like Germany and the UK increased their gas demand quite significantly, whereas countries like Turkey, extremely important gas country in our region, actually gas demand fell in that country. So this is a very, very tricky picture, and the problem when you give an overall European number is you're adding together a lot of different trends and trying to generalize on something that you can't really generalize about. Now, very important for us in Europe is, why did we get this significant recovery of gas demand in Europe last year? And the main reason we got it was that we had a combination of trends that we could not have foreseen, I would say, certainly at the beginning of 2015, but even maybe at the end of 2015. So what we had last year was a significant fall in gas prices in Europe and a significant rise in coal prices. And what you may be able to see here as you look at the different spark spreads is that the UK, which is sometimes with Germany either the first or the second most important gas market in Europe, the combination of those two price movements plus the very high, by European and in fact global standards, the very high carbon price floor or carbon tax in the UK meant that we basically backed coal out of the power sector and replaced it with gas. Renewables, incidentally, for renewable folks in the audience, stayed pretty much constant. And we had so because the UK has this extremely high carbon price, this was a huge shift towards gas. and there is this statistic that people repeat endlessly, so if you haven't heard it, I'll tell you, that sometime around the end of last year, beginning of this year, there were days when we burned no coal in power generation in the UK for the first time in more than 100 years. But going back to my theme of countries are not all the same, the UK is a very, very special place in Europe because it has a lot of extremely old coal-fired power stations that we probably should have shut down 20 years ago. We've got some relatively new and efficient gas-fired stations, and we also have limited but growing interconnections with the rest of Europe. So what happened in the UK is very interesting, but it's not necessarily representative of what happened in the rest of Europe. However, we also saw German gas-fired power demand increase a little bit, and we saw the French increase, but that was more to do with the problems they were having with their nuclear stations. So a little bit of good news, but question mark, is this good news that is going to carry on, or was this, if you like, a one-off reaction? And of course that is very much dependent on what happens to this combination of coal, gas and carbon prices in a number of different countries. So that is the, if you like, the immediate past and some reflections on the present. I thought though I'd better show you this slide because Europe is the part of the world that is obsessed with carbon reduction and the Paris Agreement and the targets. And the reason I'm showing you this slide is that this is the IEA work, but all other work shows you pretty much the same thing. If Europe is going to meet its COP21 targets, then basically what we're looking at for gas is a slow decline, possibly a reasonable flat period, but probably a slow decline in demand up to 2030, and then a much more rapid decline after that. So that is what needs to happen, assuming we don't go for carbon capture and storage, which is a little bit of a different story, which we could talk about if people want to in the discussion period. So if we're going to meet these targets, this is what has to happen to gas. So this is if you like, not a good story for the very much longer term, but not a terrible story for the next 10 years in Europe. Why is this not a terrible story? Well, because when we go towards the fascinating topic of European gas security, we have a very different story in terms of perceptions versus reality. Now, this is where the talk becomes somewhat politically incorrect, because what you should do if you're from any kind of institution or government or most of the public discussion is the big problem for European gas is the dangers of relying too much on Russia, and this is the big security problem for gas in Europe. Now, let me tell you that that is a very popular perception in the media, from governments and policy, blah, 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 blah. For gas people, that is not the problem. The big problem for gas people in Europe is almost all other gas supplies. I'll come back to Russia in a moment. But what most people, even people in Europe, don't realise is that gas production, domestic gas production, is declining much faster than anybody thought was likely to happen. And this is focused mainly on the Netherlands. I'll come back to that in just a second. But all of the other sources of gas that we had and we thought we might have, North Africa, the Southern Corridor, East Mediterranean, European shale gas, are not panning out and don't look like they're going to pan out anytime soon. This, incidentally, is nothing to do with reserves. And people put reserve tables up to look at all the gas that's around Europe. Yes, but gas that's around Europe isn't helpful to us. What we need is supply, and we need it to arrive at a price where we can afford to buy it. So basically what we see is Russian gas and LNG. And I'll come back to LNG in a moment, but the problem with LNG, security problem, is that we know from the 2011 to 2014 period, and for a period of about a couple of weeks in January this year, that once Asia needs LNG, it disappears from Europe. And it disappears very quickly. Let me just spend a slide on the European production situation, because this is so incredibly important. What has happened in the Netherlands, a very long-standing producer of gas, is that their very large Groningen field, which was found in the late 50s and has sustained not just supply but flexibility in northwest Europe for many, many decades, is not just beginning to run down, which we knew about, but has caused, I think the correct term is earth tremors. But the consequence of that is that much of the surrounding land has become unstable, and there's been a huge number of problems with dwellings in that region. And that has led to environmental protests, it's led to litigation, and that is progressively reducing the amount of gas that field can actually manage to reducing the annual output. From this picture, this is actually not up to date because the output was reduced another 10% earlier this year, and it is entirely possible, but we hope not likely, it's entirely possible that with ongoing litigation we could see the Groningen field closed down altogether within a few years. So what that means is that Europe will need more gas, more imports, and probably more infrastructure to bring those imports into Europe. Exactly the timing of this and the scale of it is not certain. But the key thing to understand is, although European demand may be falling, or may start to fall again, European supply may fall faster than that. And that is a major problem when it comes to what gas people think about security as opposed to what politicians think of as security. So let me hurry on and talk a little bit about Russia. This is a slightly confusing map, but at least it shows you where most things are happening in Russia. I want to summarize it by saying that although the CEO of Gazprom says that it's shut in production, in other words, the amount of gas that it could produce if it had markets to do so is around 160 billion cubic meters a year. We think a reasonable number is about 100 billion cubic meters. In other words, about 10 billion cubic feet a day that Russia, Gazprom, just Gazprom on its own, could produce if it had markets for it. So this is gas which it has in the ground, in fields which could easily be opened up very quickly, and it has transportation capacity to bring it not necessarily through the whole of Europe, but to a large part of Europe. And what we see here is something that we don't see anywhere else with any other supplier to Europe. So we don't know, and the Russians also don't know, exactly what they intend to do. This is an interesting question about Gazprom's strategy. But what we do know is their gas endowment is huge, and their capacity to produce and deliver it is huge. And last year, they delivered a record year for their exports to Europe ever. I've broken it down here. Its statistical base is slightly complicated, but essentially we've never seen so much Russian gas in Europe as we did last year. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you go back to the beginning of 2016, people were thinking that the LNG wave would start to hit Europe in 2016. In 2016, European LNG imports were flat or actually very, very slightly down, but it was minimal. What increased, what took all of the increase in demand was Russian gas and some Algerian gas in Italy, which is also quite interesting. So the Russians have demonstrated that they can deliver when Europe needs it, and they're also some of the only people who are looking to build new pipelines to deliver more gas to Europe, or, depending on your view, gas through other routes to Europe, and the pipelines that they want to build. This is one set, highly controversial. Those of you who are interested in this, in this kind of thing may note that last week the US Senate passed a bill which would try to prevent deliveries of equipment to this pipeline, and specifically noted that it was trying to stop Nord Stream 2 because it wants to see gas continue to flow through Ukraine, which is not what the Russians want. So we see a big fight in Europe over whether the Nord Stream 1 is the two solid lines which have been in operation since 2012. Nord Stream 2 are the two new lines which the Russians are trying to start by the end of 2019. So those are the two pipelines in the north. Here are the two pipelines in the south, the Turkish streamlines. There's a long history behind these lines, but I was expecting to read last week, I'm now expecting to read it this week, that the barge is starting to lay the first of these lines this week. The barge is definitely in the Black Sea, the pipe is there, the question is when are they going to start to lay? And the first one of these lines should be operational by 2019, and we think that will happen. So with the Russians we have a lot of potential supply and a desire to actually build new pipelines to deliver this gas to Europe. So what, therefore, of competition between Russia and the US? So this is a slide that Jim Henderson, who's director of our gas program, has developed. And what it really shows is that when you're doing these comparisons, you're very, very dependent on, first of all, the Henry Hub price. So it really depends whether Henry Hub is at 2, 2.50, 3 or higher than that. And also, and possibly less obviously, the ruble-dollar exchange rate. Reminding you that before the Ukraine crisis, the rate was 30 rubles to the dollar. It then went up to 80 rubles to the dollar. It's now at about 60 rubles to the dollar. So depending on the exchange rate, the competitiveness of Russian gas against LNG, against US LNG is quite important. So what this chart shows you is that actually the Russians are in pretty good shape at certain exchange rates to compete with Henry Hub at today's price. What it also suggests is that the Russians could adopt a strategy to try to keep the European gas price in a range that would forestall new US LNG projects. Thought it might be interesting, this slide only came to my attention at the end of last week, to show you what the Russians think about this. So this is from the Gazprom press conference that was held 10 days ago in Moscow as part of their annual general meeting. It's, if you haven't got a picture of it, it's on their website. It's not a proprietary slide. But basically what this tells you is, for as far as they're concerned, they are very, very confident that they can compete quite easily with US LNG. And those of us, I know certainly one of us was in the audience with me at the Russian Gas Society conference last week. If you heard Alexander Medvedev talking there, you would have been in no doubt that he is supremely confident that there will be no competition of any consequence between US LNG and Russian pipeline gas. But that is not the story I wanted to tell you, because, as I'm sure you know, but others would also tell you, there's going to be a lot of LNG around from a lot of different places. And so really the key issue is not what will Russian gas, how Russian gas will deal with US LNG. It's all this other LNG that's going to be around, coming on, and therefore it's going to free up Qatari LNG and other LNG that's going to Asia, which will come back to Europe to compete with whatever gas is already there. So to draw this to a close, what I really wanted to say to you is it's not about Russian gas versus US LNG, it's about Russian gas versus LNG, and from wherever that's going to come from. And what we're looking at and trying to figure out with, at the moment, a certain amount of confusion and therefore limited success are, what is going to happen to European gas demand over the next 5 years? How are gas prices going to compare with coal prices? Is anything going to happen with the carbon price? But not just in power. Are there things to say about the industrial, the residential, and particularly the transport sector, where gas can actually possibly pick up, under certain circumstances, quite a bit of demand? How fast are we going to see this domestic supply decline, especially in the Netherlands? What are we looking at in terms of the timing and reliability and competitiveness of LNG projects? Now, I unfortunately wasn't able to be here yesterday because my plane was severely delayed, but I'm sure people talked about, we've been expecting this LNG wave to arrive in our midst, but it hasn't. When is it going to arrive, and how big is it going to be? And therefore, how long is this perceived global LNG surplus when it arrives? How long is that going to continue? And all of those things will determine whether we see this backwash of LNG that nobody else wants coming into Europe to compete with Russian gas, of which undoubtedly there will be some US cargoes, but my guess would be not that many. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, that is absolutely perfect lead-in, and we'll just press on to Anne-Sophie's presentation, because the last question that you posed, I got to see her presentation in advance. She tries to answer parts of it, as you're probably aware. So please proceed.
I'm just looking for my presentation.
If you look on the desktop, it should say Corbeau.
Thank you. Here we go. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So indeed, where is this global LNG supply that everybody has been announcing for quite a long time? Resume slideshow. Yes. So far, it has not been in sight. When we are looking at the global LNG market over the past year, what we can see is that, well, the market has been relatively balanced. I have a problem here. The market has been relatively balanced. If we have had a global overall LNG supply in 2016, we would have probably have seen two things: very low gas prices and a lot of stranded gas going back to Europe. Nothing of that has happened. The global LNG supply increased by roughly 18 million tonnes per annum, but a lot of that actually went to two Asian markets, China and India, as well as going to new LNG markets like Egypt, Pakistan, and Jordan. Meanwhile, going back to Europe, well, we had actually a very small increase of 1 MTPA. So definitely no global LNG supply, global energy oversupply, sorry. However, the whole of Europe, remains to be the balancing market. And as Jonathan mentioned, we didn't see a lot of LNG going back to Europe, but because gas demand increased and production declined, this was actually in favor of Russian pipeline gas. Now, why did we not see this global LNG oversupply? Well, actually, this is coming from the supply point of view. When we are looking at the LNG supply evolution globally, notably over the period 2014-2016, and this is what you can see here with the blue bars, a lot of markets actually saw their LNG exports declining. Yemen is no longer exporting, Libya is no longer exporting, Egypt is exporting a little bit, Angola has been very slow to restart, and despite the fact that we have a very impressive increase in LNG supplies from Australia, well, actually, this is a little bit disappointing, notably if you consider the underperformance of Gorgon and also the few issues on the East Coast with the different projects in Gladstone. So, yes, this is a very impressive increase, but it could have been much better. And the consequence of that is that when you are looking, okay, we have problems with that thing here.
Just use the arrow machine.
Yeah, the computer's not on the,
The computer is doing very strange
on
things.
the screen. It points-
No, seriously, I have resume slideshow.
Should we go? There's arrows.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I really.
There you go.
Here we go, finally. When you are looking at the difference between the additions in LNG capacity here in green and the addition in terms of LNG trade, I mean, there is really a difference. We have had it over 2014, 2016, about 65 MTPA, but actually the trade increased by only 27. So you would have expected that there would be a lot of LNG on the global LNG markets right now, but this is not happening because of all the supply issues that I mentioned previously. Now, when we are looking forward, well, finally, I mean, this LNG will come to the market, and we expect to have about 100 MTPA arriving to the market in over 2017, 2022. But the problem is that when you are looking beyond 2020, well, there is not that much of additional LNG capacity which is arriving. I mean, so far, only one project, which is starting after 2020, has been sanctioned. This is Mozambique's Coral FLNG, and that's it. Beyond 2020, well, maybe we will see some Qatari LNG coming to the market because the moratorium has been lifted 2 months ago, but nothing has been sanctioned yet. So we have a huge question mark. I mean, yes, definitely we might have global LNG oversupply over the next few years as this LNG trade is finally building up. Although, I mean, whether we have a glut or not will depend on many conditions. First of all, whether all these additional LNG plants are arriving on time, whether they are performing well, and you have seen that it's not always the case with the previous LNG export plants, and also the relative prices of oil, gas, and coal. Because if gas-fired plants are not competitive against coal-fired plants, then the demand is going to be much lower in many places, including in Asia. So that's also something to take into account. Additionally, the import infrastructure in new markets will be also fundamental. As you have seen in 2016, I mean, key growth markets were these new players, Egypt, Jordan, Pakistan, etc., the new small markets, but the new markets, so they are really fundamental. Now, when we are looking at what has happened in terms of final investment decision, gosh, I really have no luck with this thing today. When we are looking at these new LNG plants which have come online, I mean, only 3 final investment decisions have been taken over the past 18 months. And each of them was only for one train. So there is not that much of capacity which has been sanctioned. Yes, you can say there is a lot of LNG which is arriving to the market, but this is showing also the fact that, well, we don't know what is going to happen post-2020. Oil and gas prices are very low. There are some question marks about where the new LNG demand is going to come from. And also, I mean, the cost of the projects were very high before, and now you need to have very cost-competitive LNG projects. So looking forward, what we can see is that, well, there might be some potential FIDs in 2017, but when you're looking at the projects, it's actually FLNG, a few expansion, and not that many greenfield projects. That's actually the key problem here. And it poses actually a fundamental question. What kind of projects are we going to see going forward? And I can see really, I mean, some likely winners in this kind of picture that is being drawn for the global LNG market. On one side, you would have, you know, the brownfield project, the Qatar lifting the moratorium and expanding, debottlenecking the LNG liquefaction plant. Also, I mean, potential utilization of existing underutilized liquefaction plants. I mean, that's the case for Egypt, that's the case for Trinidad and Tobago, for Oman. not always easy from a diplomatic point of view. You would also have, the projects in which some buyers have a strategic interest, those which are really cost competitive, those which have an advantage in terms of being liquids, or maybe some FLNG like the Golar ones. But any project which has a problem, whether it's a fiscal, it's a regulatory problem, it's a technical uncertainty, any kind of problem which may make the project more expensive, these projects are going to be back on the back burner. That's fundamental. Now, looking globally, well, there is about 1,000 MTPA of projects which are currently at the planning stage. Obviously, not everybody is going to move ahead. A lot of these projects are actually located in 4 regions: North America, East Africa, Russia, and Australia. And a few of them are also located in different places. And I mean, we should definitely not dismiss them. I honestly would expect, for example, the project in Equatorial Guinea, Fortuna FLNG, to move ahead this year. So small projects, if they are cost competitive, can also be lucky. But looking back at our 4 or even 5 giants, if I am splitting North America between Canada and the US, well, who is going to really move ahead? I mean, Canada, mostly big LNG projects, not very easy. Greenfield projects also facing a lot of different issues, including with the First Nations and building the pipeline, so not easy at all. US LNG projects, well, a lot of people are betting on that, but for me, the key question is, right now, we are not seeing these projects recovering completely their capital costs. So if you are going to your bank and you're saying, hey, I have this absolutely wonderful project, it's either going to be based on Henry Hub Plus or it's going to be based on a fixed price, can you please lend me some money? And the bank is going to tell you, well, I'm looking at Cheniere, I mean, they're not really recovering their capital costs, so I'm not quite sure. I mean, what is your outlook for the LNG projects and how high do you expect prices to be in Europe and in Asia? That's not going to be very easy. East Africa, also quite interesting but very challenging region. Greenfield projects, so not particularly easy. Russia also, same thing with the additions of the sanctions. And Australia, finally, well, it was a relatively high cost, but very positive regulatory environment. Now we have moved to very high cost, and on top of that, relatively negative environment. So I think Australia has been put on the back burner for quite a long time now. But do not forget about, a lot of small projects there and there in Equatorial Guinea or Papua New Guinea, for example. Now, looking at demand, well, what is particularly interesting for the demand side is that we have a lot of new markets. But these markets are different. These markets tend to be smaller markets. They don't want to commit for a very long time, and they will want to have, small quantities, and they may also be looking for different indexations. You would have these small markets in, Africa, the Middle East, Central America, potentially here in Asia, with Indonesia, for example. And on top of that, you will continue to have our traditional markets, Asia, with, of course, some uncertainties on the future of nuclear and the competitiveness of coal and gas-fired generation. India, India is a huge question mark for me. As the Prime Minister keeps talking about a gas-based economy. Okay, what is behind your gas-based economy? We need gas at $5 per MMBTU. Aha, okay, well. Any LNG suppliers interested to supply India at $5 per MMBTU, considering the cost of new liquefaction capacity? That's not obvious. So, yes, there is a lot of potential in the LNG market, but it's not easy. And fundamentally, you need to have very competitive LNG. You don't want to have LNG at $15 per MMBTU. I think the episode that we saw in 2011, 2014, when we had LNG prices at $15, $16, $17 per MMBTU in Asia has damaged a lot the reputation of LNG, because it has shown that, LNG can be very expensive. And this is a little bit frightening for new consumers, and this is also frightening for politicians. But I just want to look at a potential market. Okay, probably not the one that you would think first. Africa. Well, there are about 10 projects or 10 countries which are looking at importing LNG in Africa. Honestly, beyond Egypt, I think 4 of them have relatively good chances: Morocco, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa, without any preference in terms of the ranking. I'm just going from north to south. One very interesting characteristic about all these projects is that most of them, except for Morocco, although it's not done yet, are FSRUs. Easy to put in place, not a long time, and can be also flexible, and, well, just in case the buyer is not paying, can also be removed. And most of these projects are also LNG to power projects, whereby in some cases, actually, the seller of LNG is actually willing to make the downstream investments. So they are no longer selling, just the LNG, but they might actually sell the whole thing from the LNG to the power generation, which is not going to be easy because you want to structure your project so that you can take into account the differences between the FSRU on one side and the power project on the other side. I mean, this is not going to be easy from a project finance point of view. But, however, I think this kind of methodology has good chances to actually make it happen in Africa and also in other regions like, potentially Southeast Asia, but also Latin America. Integrated project. Another area which is of interest is, of course, the transport, and in particular the shipping area. I mean, here when you are looking at the difference in terms of consumption between a ferry and a bus or a ferry and a taxi, I mean, you can see that, we are looking at 1,000 or 10,000. I mean, this is huge. The thing is, for the shipping industry, there are really 2 things which matter. The first is environmental conditions. And since the IMO decision last October that we are going to put some restrictions on the level of sulfur in the fuels, well, we are definitely going in that direction. And in specific regions, they are also enforcing this kind of regulation. However, there is another thing which is extremely important in the shipping industry: cost. And how long is it going to take me to recover my investments? Because, investing in LNG is kind of expensive. So, because of the oil and price collapse over the past few years, while it was making sense actually to invest and to convert your ship to LNG a few years ago, in particular up to 2014, now the economics are not so obvious. Unless there is a little bit of help in the conversion of a boat to LNG or in a new acquisition. And this is exactly what Norway is doing. They have a NOx fund there, which is covering up to 80% of the investment cost. So this does help, and this is probably why now you have a lot of LNG ships in Norway. So, you need some kind of governmental help. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit difficult to start. This is probably Jonathan's favorite picture, at least the packet of kittens done in the... This is what the industry looked like about 15 years ago. A very small and cozy club of people who knew very well each other. Well, now if you are going to any LNG conference in the world, you are not going to recognize everybody. There will be a lot of new players. There will be a lot of new players in the upstream part. Now you are seeing people like, the Schlumberger, the Perenco, etc. You are going to see a lot of traders. Traders are very interested, of course, and they want to enter the global LNG market. And this is why we are seeing people like Gunvor, for example, trading, and a lot of other people. And also, in the buyer side, there are a lot of companies, new Chinese buyers which are emerging, and new LNG importing countries. So the market is now completely different. This is interesting because this is putting in question, the traditional practices of the LNG industry. But this is not easy to handle. That's really the key question mark. How is the LNG industry going to evolve from the point where it was at the very beginning the kind of a little brother of the pipeline business? We were going point to point, and then it became more flexible, but now the flexibility is pretty much everywhere. And this is actually very visible when you are looking at the contracts which were signed over 2015-2016. These contracts are shorter. A lot of contracts are actually below in terms of the long-term contracts, because there are also a lot of short-term contracts below 4 years, but a lot of the long-term contracts, which traditionally were 20 years long, now they are less than 10 or 15 years long. That's one thing. Portfolio players, now they represent the majority of the LNG which is going to be traded, especially if you're looking at the new long-term contracts. And the quantities are also very small, traditionally less than 1 MTPA. So, small contracts, shorter duration, and a lot of portfolio. These are going to be the characteristics of the LNG industry, I think, going forward. More and more we are going to go in that direction, which, of course, poses a lot of questions. And what is not in the previous graphic is also the question about pricing. Where are we going in terms of pricing? We are in a buyer's market, and buyers are becoming more and more difficult. Buyers, they want to have better pricing conditions. They may want to have different pricing indexation. And, well, sometimes you have Qatar saying, yeah, well, that's all very good, but, we are not ready to accept any kind of pricing renegotiation that you may want. So where is this going to lead us? Well, what the buyers want is end of final destination clauses, more flexible LNG, and in some cases, moving away from oil indexation. Although probably these days, with relatively low oil prices, they are not in a hurry. There may be some who still want to move away from oil indexation because they want to diversify their portfolio of indexation. I think the final destination clauses are probably the ones which will go first. There is a lot of activity in Japan in order to get rid of that. And honestly, I think it will go at some point, as it disappeared in the European Union, because the European Commission put a lot of pressure on that. Oil indexation, well, as we all know, there is a lot of interest in the region, in Singapore, in China, in Japan, but let's face it, it's going to take some time, and there is also a lot of work to be done on the downstream market, not so much in Singapore, but definitely in Japan and China, in order for the market to be ready, because, you need things like third-party access to the LNG terminals and to the pipeline system, because otherwise you don't really have a market per se. You will have some kind of regulated market. Doesn't really work very well with trading. And finally, we are going to have a lot of flexible LNG, because there is some uncommitted LNG, a lot of flexible US LNG, and what I think is that also many long-term contracts are not going to be renegotiated, especially for the markets which are already oversupplied. That means that we will have a lot of available, flexible LNG, which can be then traded either in terms of short-term LNG or in terms of spot LNG. So the markets are definitely going to be changing. But for me, really the key question that I'm going to leave you with is, who is going to take final investment decision over the coming years, despite the relatively low oil and gas price environment? Because we need that LNG. Otherwise, we are going to have a supply squeeze beyond 2020. Whether the market are rebalancing by 2022, 2023 is irrelevant. If you want to ensure a long-term future for natural gas and LNG, people have to take a long-term view and have to take some final investment decision now. It's a bet, but otherwise, you are going to have prices going through the roof, and this is exactly what politicians and buyers do not like. So affordable LNG is absolutely essential for the long-term future of natural gas. Thank you very much for your attention.
Perfect summary. We'll press on right on to Bob, and then we'll open the floor to all the questions that are out there after that. So please, Bob, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I just want to announce a schedule change. We're going to be here 1 hour more to discuss all of these things, because the three speakers who've spoken already, including Jeff, and Jonathan and Anne-Sophie have such deep knowledge in this area that I have at least 100 questions myself, and I'm sure you do too. So thank you all for what you've said before, and in a way we are, I think I need to bring this up a little bit. We're segueing a little bit more from the deep knowledge that these three individuals have into methodology. How do we take that deep knowledge and incorporate that in a way that can trade off all of these complexities in a growing